This video will cover the U.S. Coast Guard. I'm Nicholas, and you're watching the Law Enforcement Agency Information Channel. The U.S. Coast Guard, or USCG for short, is a military-staffed, maritime, uniformed, United States federal law enforcement agency and branch of the U.S. Armed Forces that falls under the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, or DHS for short. It is one of the very few. It is the only branch of the U.S. Armed Forces that falls under the Department of Homeland Security, and additionally, it is also the only branch of the U.S. Armed Forces that has law enforcement authority. However, I will get into that later. Anyways, the U.S. Coast Guard is responsible for enforcing federal maritime laws, conducting search and rescue operations, and providing aid and assistance to emergencies and incidents at sea. This includes protecting and patrolling domestic and international seas throughout the U.S. exclusive economic zone, protecting and patrolling domestic and international sea ports of entry, responding to emergencies at U.S. seas, such as boat crashes, drowning people, etc., intercepting and deterring threats towards in-sea threats towards homeland, such as wartime threats, drug trafficking, gun trafficking, human trafficking, etc., and investigating federal maritime crimes. Sorry, my computer almost shut off there. Investigating federal maritime crimes, which is essentially any crime that takes place at sea, especially crimes that take place at federally owned seas, owned or operated seas. So this includes homicide, murder at sea, arson at sea. It's just not that common. Sorry, bad example. And etc. Additionally, another one of their duties include working with local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies and fellow branches of the military, such as the U.S. Navy, U.S. Marine Corps. U.S. Customs and Border Protection, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, U.S. Secret Service, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and etc. That's really it for their main responsibilities. The U.S. Coast Guard was founded on the 4th of August, 1790, by an act of Congress, upon a recommendation from Alexander Hamilton, who at the time served as the Secretary of the Treasury. Now, again, because it did come from Alexander Hamilton, he did request that it be established under his department, which, as I mentioned earlier, he was the Secretary of the Treasury, and therefore his department was the U.S. Department of the Treasury. And so it was. Congress established the U.S. Coast Guard in 1790 under the U.S. Department of the Treasury, as requested by Alexander Hamilton. However, it was not founded as the U.S. Coast Guard. In fact, the name U.S. Coast Guard didn't come to the agency until the early 1900s. It was founded as the Revenue Cutter Service, which was essentially responsible for collecting federal revenue taxes from ships importing goods into the U.S. Now this became an essential need after the American Revolutionary War. So yeah, but then later on, in around 1862, the U.S. Coast Guard. I meant the in around 1862, the what was it? The Internal Revenue Service, or IRS for short, was established. Sorry, my computer almost shut off there. The IRS, or Internal Revenue Service, was established, which basically had replaced many of the duties of the Revenue Cutter Service. And then later on, in around 1875, the U.S. Life Saving Service was established. And the reason why I'm bringing that up is because the U.S. Life Saving Service and the Revenue Cutter Service ended up merging later on. And that later on happened in around 1915. When the U.S. Life Saving Service and the Revenue Cutter Service were merged, which formally created the U.S. Coast Guard. So yes, this was around the time where the U.S. Coast Guard got its official name. So yeah, and then later on, in around 1839, the the U.S. Lifehouse, the U.S. Lifehouse Service was merged with the U.S. Coast Guard. Was merged by the U.S. Coast Guard. And then around 1842, the Bureau of Marine Inspection and Navigation the Bureau of Marine Inspection and Navigation was merged by the U.S. Coast Guard. And then did I say eight? I hope I said 19. I hope I said 1942. If I said 1842, my bad. I meant 1942. I'm getting a bit off track now. Anyways, later on, in around the sorry, computer almost shut off there. In around the 1980s or 1960s, the U.S. No, I think it was around. Yeah, it was around 1960 that the U.S. Coast Guard was transferred to the authority of the U.S. Department of Transportation. And then later on, around 2003, shortly after the September 11th attacks and the Homeland Security Act, the U.S. Coast Guard was transferred to the authority of the newly found U.S. Department of Homeland Security, or DHS for short, where it remains today. So, yeah, that's really it for their history, and hope you learned something. During peacetime, which is now, by the way, thank God, the U.S. Coast Guard falls under the Department of Homeland Security. However, during wartime, the U.S. Coast Guard falls under the Department of the Navy, which would make it one of the the third military service branch of the Department of the Navy. Fun fact, even with the addition of the U.S. Coast Guard, the Department of the Navy would still be considered the smallest military department within the Department of Defense. It's important to note that even during wartime, with the transfer of authority to the Department of the Navy, the U.S. Coast Guard still maintains its law enforcement powers. So, yeah. The U.S. Coast Guard is what you call one in a kind, as it is the only branch of the U.S. military with law enforcement authority. Additionally, it is also the only branch of the U.S. military that is not restricted by the Posse Contaminus Act. I think I'm pronouncing that right, which is essentially a federal statute that prohibits members of the military from participating in law enforcement related duties. Additionally, the U.S. Coast Guard is also the only branch of the U.S. military that falls under the Department of Homeland Security. In fact, its authority under the Department of Homeland Security is most likely one of the reasons for its law enforcement authority. So, in more simpler terms, if you were to join the U.S. Coast Guard, you would not only be considered a member of the military, but also a federal law enforcement officer, which is pretty cool for a branch of the military. Anyways, the U.S. Coast Guard maintains domestic-wide jurisdiction throughout the United States and its individual territories to enforce federal laws. Its jurisdiction is typically referred to as the Exclusive Economic Zone, or EEZ for short. However, aside from their legal jurisdiction and authority, they also conduct a wide range of international operations, and they do still maintain law enforcement authorities outside the exclusive economic zone. So yeah. As I mentioned earlier, during peacetime, the U.S. Coast Guard falls under the Department of Homeland Security, and therefore reports to the Secretary of Homeland Security, who reports to the President of the United States. However, during wartime, again, as I mentioned earlier, they fall under the Department of the Navy, under the Department of Defense. And therefore report to the Secretary of the Navy, who reports to the Secretary of Defense, who furthermore reports to the President of the United States. Yeah. Typically, I don't study the military. However, because this particular branch of the military maintains law enforcement authority, I do study it. One of the things I study is its rank structure, which, as you can probably guess, is what you would expect for the military. It's actually pretty similar to the rank structure of the U.S. Navy. But anyways, the rank structure of the U.S. Coast Guard from low to high is in the following order. Recruit, or non-rated enlisted personnel, petty officer, chief petty officer, chief warrant officer 2, chief warrant officer 3, chief warrant officer 4, junior officer, senior officer, and then lastly flag officer. The U.S. Coast Guard is broken down into district commands, area commands, sectors, and other components. Each component of the U.S. Coast Guard reports to a specific position, all ending up reporting to the commandment of the U.S. Coast Guard. These specific components include the resources, the intelligence and criminal investigations, the deputy commandment for operations, the deputy commandment for mission support, the Atlantic area command, the Pacific area command, and yeah, that's really it. U.S. Coast Guardsmen trained for approximately 4 years at the U.S. Coast Guard Academy, located in New London, Connecticut. Now, it's important to note that while the U.S. Coast Guard Academy does train U.S. Coast Guardsmen, who, in addition to being members of the military, are also federal law enforcement officers. The U.S. Coast Guard Academy is not considered a federal law enforcement academy, but instead a military academy that trains a branch of the military with both law enforcement and military authority. But in addition to that, the U.S. Coast Guard also maintains its own law enforcement academy, known as the U.S. Coast Guard Maritime Law Enforcement Academy, which explicitly trains maritime U.S. Coast Guard maritime law enforcement specialists. Now, as commonly mistaken, you do not need to have attended the U.S. Coast Guard Academy in order to attend the U.S. Coast Guard Maritime Law Enforcement Academy. That is not needed. But anyways, when it comes to the U.S. Coast Guard Academy, because I would like to talk about this, it is actually a pretty good academy. It is a government-funded, tuition-free academy that, again, you will stay at for approximately 4 to 5 years, but it is a tuition-free academy, which is pretty nice. You will be paid, actually. Wait, sorry, my computer almost shut off there. Since you will be there for 4 years, you will be paid, so that way you can afford your basic needs, such as rent, food, etc. However, you will be living on a campus area, within a campus area. So, yeah.